Hey guys, it's John here again. In this video, I'd like to go over a topic that's often asked this time of year, and that is how to read more books in the new year. So often this is part of people's New Year's resolutions. So in 2000 and XX, I'm going to read this many books, or just trying to basically get into a habit of reading more books as part of a daily routine. Now, I can understand this because I've long found it difficult to sit down and find the time to actually cut out distractions, pick up a book and read it from cover to cover. And often people do have trouble with time constraints. So when you've been at work all day, you have to come home and cook dinner, you've got kids to look after, or even if you don't, you're often left without a lot of energy. And so the last thing you have time for is to sit down for an hour and read a book. And it can be very demoralizing to sort of have this huge book in front of you, and you have say 300 pages to read left, and you think, oh my god, how am I ever going to finish this? And I've had the same problem as you as this, and I've found a couple of ways to get around this. And this year I've gone from reading maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 books in a single year to over 107 books in the last year. Now, that sounds like a high number, and it's huge, and it is pretty huge. It's a product of a few different tips I'm going to share with you in this video. None of them involve cheating. You will actually be reading these books, and you will be taking in the information. But hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a couple of tips that will help you sort of have that same trajectory in reading capacity. So my first tip for you to help yourself read more books is to have a purpose. So if you're trying to read books in a rather random basis, ones that sort of look interesting, you can have a much harder time finishing them if you're not personally invested in what's being wrote about in the book. So if you've got a book that sort of happens to be popular and you're sort of finding it kind of interesting to read but not really invested, it's going to be a lot harder for you to actually finish that book because reason I've just said. So here's something different you can try. Think of the biggest problems you have in your life, the ones that sort of gnaw you on a daily basis. Like, say, if you've got a problem with your boss at work, if you've got a problem with your dating life, if you've got a problem with you're more interested in fixing computers or fixing something around the house, write out a list of these things that you have problems with, and try to find the ones that most bother you and ones that you think you can sort of most action with books, and go on Amazon and buy the books. Doing it this way means you'll have an actual problem that you need to solve and want to solve. So for example, with me, the reason I actually wrote my first book was because I'd read so many crappy books on storytelling. And so I'd originally set out to write a book that was a fiction story or a screenplay. And so I naturally went out to try and do some research how to write a good story. So I read Story by Robert McKee, The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. And both of them are good books, but I had really specific problems with the style of those books. And the reason I was able to sort of make that distinction and sort of find those problems was because I was really invested in the material. Like I was really trying to find the best tips and best tricks I could use for my own story. If you find a problem that you're really invested in, like the ones described before, you'll find it a lot easier to turn the page because you'll actively be looking for interesting things in the content. If you find that the book's quite difficult to read, or it's quite turgid or badly written, and then you find it difficult to read as a result of that, know that it isn't your fault, that it's the writer's fault. I can tell you right now that as a book writer myself, we have this sort of thing about making sure that our writing is really concise and to the point, and it's a real sin to forget that and write really like sort of fluffy long prose that doesn't really sort of go anywhere. It's a good practice to have really punchy sentences that sort of really distill the essence of what you're trying to say and eliminate clutter. A great book for that, by the way, if you're looking into writing, is On Writing Well by William Zinsser, which I'll put in the description. So check that out. That leads me to my next point after that. So my next point is find formats that work for you best. So one of the main reasons, aside from the book writing, obviously, that I got into reading so many books was that I got into audiobooks. Now, being somebody who works in an office and had, at the time, a relatively long commute, I found it really useful and expedient to sign up for Audible and download some audiobooks that I found interesting and listen to them. So these audiobooks are quite long. Some of them are about 20, I think some of them are about 27, 28 hours, so pretty long books. But because I was listening to them while I was writing code at work, or while I was doing the dishes or just driving home, I was sort of getting the information and sort of learning it as well as I would have been if I was reading. Now for me, this worked really well. And one thing I would say to you guys to remember is that audiobooks are real books. And never let anyone tell you that if you've read an audiobook, you haven't really read the book. You definitely have. And the point is that if you have listened to the audiobook and really understood the content that the author trying to get across to you, of course you've read the book. You've probably read it better than most of the people who've sort of skim read it and sort of half paid attention. So definitely take that into account. And the second thing as well on this point is that I also love Kindle editions of books. So I have 297 Kindle books in my library. So there's a lot of books, and obviously also a lot of money to try to spend on books. But the point being is that I can get instant access to these books from Amazon at any time I want. They are usually a lot cheaper than the paper editions of the books. That's a different topic entirely. Don't let me get into that. Cases where they're not. That's what I'm saying. But the point is that I also find it a lot more digestible to try and read the books on my Kindle device or my Kindle app on my phone rather. So I like to quickly read the books. I can skim. No, not skim. Skim is the wrong word. I can quickly move from page to page, chapter to chapter. I find it a lot faster and easier to read in Kindle form. And it also allows me to highlight passages that I like, which is really useful for me. So something that I do in my research for writing books is that I'll read Kindle books and I'll highlight passages and quotes that I think are interesting, and then I can make notes of those and come back to them. So when I'm actually writing, I can refer back to those and use those. But it's so much easier to have that digital copy on your Kindle device, and because it's cloud-based, you can go on, as well as my Android phone. I also have an iPhone, and if I go on the iPhone and sync my Kindle app, I get all the same highlights, so it's all there. And I think the third point in this list would be to not feel pressured to read books just because they're sort of a hot topic at the moment. Now, books often get sold quite well because they're like, for example, 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. It's very heavily talked about in the press and on the blogosphere and that kind of thing. And it's a great book, but don't necessarily feel in a hurry to read it. It's perfectly reasonable to have a long TBR. Now, a TBR is a to be read list, and you should never feel bad about having books sort of on your to read list. One thing I often find, I often hear from people who are a bit sort of insecure about their reading ability and don't want to admit it, is that they say, "Oh, you have a lot of books, but how many of you actually read?" Which is a bit hilarious given the small number that they've probably read. But your response to that should be, well, it's good because I've got so much more stuff to read ahead of me, and it's like knowing that you have some whole new Netflix series to watch. It's like, I'm so excited about this. It's the same principle. Never feel bad about having a long TBR. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to have, and you should feel excited about it and not negative. Now, my fourth tip to you is to take small steps. So one thing I do with books that I'm not particularly enjoying, but I know that I probably should read, which by itself as a practice I maybe would sort of not necessarily recommend, but it's more up to you if you can do it, is read a set amount every day, and it can be a small amount. So maybe read one chapter per day. Now, that can often be a lot easier than thinking, I'm going to read this entire book in X amount of time. And if you have, say, like a Leo Tolstoy novel or some other, enormous tome ahead of you, don't feel afraid of the fact that you got so many pages ahead of you. You can often break that down into smaller chunks. And just like anything at work or creative project that you have, you often succeed not by, being an awesome genius and, doing the entire thing in one night. Break the task down into small, manageable chunks. So if you have that dedication to sit down each night and read one chapter, and that can often be only about 4 pages, you can have the book done in about a month or two. Most books have no more than 30 chapters, and if they do, then it's just more time, and you'll get there because one chapter a day is easier. And you can say, well, if I miss a day, then I can either say, write it off, or I can say, okay, I'll make up 2 chapters tomorrow. It's not something to get stressed about. The point of this sort of final tip of mine for reading more books is that you should never feel scared about the number of pages ahead of you in a book. You should always be able to break it down into small chunks, and the best way to do that for me is to do 1 chapter a day or some small amount a day. Alright guys, those are my tips for reading more books in 2019. If you have any thoughts yourself or anything that's worked for you in the past, then definitely put them in the comments down below, and definitely like and subscribe to the channel. Alright, thanks guys.